The time has come. The time to talk once again about Zack Snyder and Rebel Moon. Unlike a resounding majority of you, I actually enjoyed the first entry into Snyder's space epic. Yes, it was chock full of issues, but I found them easy to overlook. At least much easier than I did in movies like BVS. But the open dialogue from the last video did bring great points to the conversation. Points about failed characterization and arcs, poor use of timing, and many long-term Snyder fans even going so far to point out that this movie had some of Snyder's worst cinematography to date. Given all that, I can say with 100% certainty that if Part 1 wasn't your thing, Part 2 will not be winning you over. We'll get into deeper details in a moment, but from a top-down view, I actually thought this movie was the weaker of the two. Unfortunately, I had two separate points while watching this where I had to pause the movie just to see how much longer I had to go, which is never what you want your viewers doing. Hey! Put that away, what are you doing? A lot of people talk about Snyder's constant need for more time to tell his story, but I don't think that's the case here. I think he improperly chooses his scenes. With a few changes to characters and some cutting around Part 1 and 2's fluff, I think the mediocre Parts 1 and 2 could have made for a really compelling single movie. But like I said, we're going to talk about all of this in detail a little bit later. So without further ado, let's talk about Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. By the by, this video will contain heavy spoilers for Rebel Moon Part 2, so if you haven't seen it yet, I'd advise checking it first and hopping back here after the fact. You've been warned. We'll kick off the video the same way Zack kicks off the new movie, with a brief reminder of what came before. I gave Zack a lot of dues in Part 1. I mostly liked the characters, feeling they had potential for meaningful storylines as the series progressed, but that video wasn't void of complaints. My main issue being how things were paced, and the timing of Kai's betrayal at the end of Part 1. That whole final act feeling shoveled together just to give that part an exciting climax. We'd also discuss characters like Jimmy and Private Aris, their arc helping contribute to a 40-minute village segment before the actual journey kicked off in the Child of Fire. Matters made worse by the fact that Jimmy and Aris seemed as if they were being set up to be the main heroes alongside Kora, but were benched for that last hour and a half of movie. So how does the Scargiver address my concerns? And not just mine. Many of you provided a number of issues with character dynamics for our team, proving that each felt more like a role than an actual character. Something that had to be addressed for this movie. So let's start there, with the team of recruits aiding Kora in the defense of Velt. Beyond Kora and Gunner, Rebel Moon has given real focus to the characters of Tarak, Nemesis, and General Titus. I want to start with Titus first. When it came to my video on Child of Fire, I completely forgot to mention Titus at all, because I'd completely forgotten he was a character. Titus really didn't serve purpose to the first half of the story, but the Scargiver looks to amend this. This isn't a completely unheard of tactic. In movies and stories that feature large group ensembles, some characters will serve different sized roles across the adventure. Age of Ultron gave us a lot more focus into the characters of Hawkeye and Black Widow, where they were lacking in the first film. And the popular anime One Piece regularly boosts different crew members to important roles across their different arcs, characters like Usopp being well overdue for his big arc. So Part 1 sidelining Titus to spotlight him here makes sense, and a lot of work is done. Of all characters, he felt the most natural to his role in the narrative. Titus was recruited as a leader, and he proves he's the leader the village needs. He feels personalized, to the point that the villagers' faith in him actually feels genuine, and this little moment between him and Hagen at the end of the battle feels earned. That said, while I feel Titus came a long way in thanks to his work with the villagers, I do feel the relationship between him and Kora fell flat. They had few scenes together where Zack and his team tried to build chemistry through mutual trust and respect. And while both are accomplished heroes, neither does anything that feels like they should have had the bond that they did. Especially since there were small moments to hint at this soldier-like bond that then dissipated until their next interaction 40 minutes later. I get this was done so that Titus could later motivate Kora to get moving for the events of a future part, but I feel there were better means to do this, and we'll discuss those later. That said, I did think the actors did a great job of building an on-screen brotherhood between Titus and Tarak, the pair having small moments that builds a believable friendship. So when the time comes that they're leading their troops on the front line, that chemistry leads you to feel that the pair are a power duo capable of anything so long as they're fighting together. Unfortunately, that's about all the praise I can give to Tarak this movie, which is a shame since he was the character I really liked in the first part. Tarak makes zero progress this movie. He's still the compassionate and noble fighter we were introduced to, but really nothing more. And what's worse, his original purpose seems wholly abandoned. My main takeaway from Tarak's introduction is that he's a beast tamer. Seeing as they were on Velt farmland, I figured Tarak would find some way to rally the wildlife here to even the odds against the vast numbers of the Mother World. Instead, he's just another soldier. A tough one with some flashy sequences, but flashy is all I'll give them. Nemesis, meanwhile, falls right smack in the middle in my look on Tarak and Titus. Nemesis was a character that Zack fully understood, but seemed to have some trouble relaying. She's been introduced to us as the defender of children, and that's what she does, her role in the battle being the protection of non-combatants. Admittedly though, that's a pretty lackluster role for one of our main heroes in the grand scheme of things, so let's introduce some spice. Giving Nemesis a young child to bond with was a great idea, but the execution feels stilted, starting with awkward glances that feel, well, strange to say the least. Personally, I think introducing the boy with this scene and setting him up as the village's lovable troublemaker would have been enough. And then show him upset over being sidelined from fighting. So when Nemesis catches him trying to steal a weapon, she instead gifts him a knife and teaches him how to defend himself. This still perfectly connects the pair, and sets up his role in her final fight and death. I get that Zack's strengths lie in his visuals, but sometimes there's nothing wrong with letting some action speak, rather than awkward shots and glances. But on to the topic of actions and talking, we need to talk about the absolute worst scene in the Scargiver. A scene that as a fellow writer actually made me get up for a moment when I realized exactly what Snyder's writing team had just done. I've mentioned this in a few of my past videos, but for those unaware, I actually went to school for film production. Please don't ask me how much money I burned on that. While there, we were given a number of do's and don'ts to filmmaking, and one many of us constantly fell prey to was a scene like this. I'll straight up admit my exact scenario to you. I was in a screenwriting class, and towards the end of the semester, after turning in our penultimate draft, my professor reached out to me with some edits. Her major complaint being that while I had good characters and arcs, they rarely at any time spent building bonds with each other, which made it very hard to believe they all chose to be so self-sacrificing for each other in the climax. Now, a good writer would have spent those last 2 weeks of class time re-evaluating the story and finding where I could alter beats and put some characters together to build their bonds. What I did was build a 3-page scene where our characters go for one last night on the town together, to bond and share stories under the guise of this possibly being their final night. Being the good teacher she was, my professor came to speak with me sometime after my final project was submitted, and made it clear to me that all this scene did was make it clear I was checking off a quota, and not adding anything of real meaning to the story. Dropping back from my own experience, the second Titus calls for everyone to share their backstories, I was transported back to what lazy 20-year-old me did to avoid doing the actual work in the last 2 weeks of my semester. It was bad enough for me to do that as a college student, but seeing professionals make this mistake was jarring. And while I don't want to assume negatives, this mistake is often one built from laziness, not ignorance. Just to clarify, having one last big hurrah before the big final clash isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but those scenes have to be earned. They're moments where we see how far the characters have come and how they've built trust with one another. They're not meant to substitute for the actual bonding process, and if the only use is to build character chemistry so some tension can be felt, then it's not being utilized correctly. Now, before we go and touch on Kora herself, I do want to chat about the true heart and soul of the original Rebel Moon story, the village on Velt. Everything so far built around the fate of this small innocent village rendered helpless under the hand of the Mother World. It's pretty normal for most big budget movies to render a village like this to a mere setting, a path of destruction for our heroes rather than a living, breathing thing, as is what happened to New York in the Avengers and Metropolis in Man of Steel. But the villagers play a prominent role in the fighting. Personally, I actually felt something watching so many of them fall during the battle. These weren't fully fleshed out characters, but there was a strong heart to this village, and I felt the pain in every loss. And all its big players get a moment. a role to play in the major battle. Den dies fighting for his people, having gone right for Noble after watching him slaughter so many of his friends. There's a feel of nobility to his death. When Den was introduced, being the village hunk, I expected him to play a more antagonistic role to Gunnar and Kora, and was worried that with their return, some sort of love triangle fiasco would break out. But Den stood as a part of that village heart. I felt more over his death than I did Nemesis. We spent a lot of time in this village, and this does pay off. Hagen's role as the new village leader not only gives Kora that shoulder to lean on, but provides Titus with a strong partner to guide the village, and helps cement his character. And Sam gets to work closely with Private Aris to defend the women and children, allowing her to earn a moment of her own during the defense of the village. And speaking of Aris, we finally get a good answer to the question of why he remained in the village. From talking to a lot of you in the previous video's comments, you all shared my annoyance over Aris just disappearing into the village after the rescue of Sam. Here, we see he's played an important role, convincing the Motherworld that all is under control on Velt, sparing the villagers from their wrath. So, I definitely see this as reason enough to let Aris' absence from the rest of Part 1 slide. This makes perfect sense in world, and I do give kudos to Zack for thinking of this. Not many would even acknowledge something like this being in play. Still, while it explains his absence, he doesn't have a large role to play in Part 2. Sure, he's important to some moments, but Aris had a lot of time spent setting him up. Time that felt misplaced, as even through Part 2, he just feels like a named background character. And with the way Part 2 ends, Aris' story seems over. He's unlikely to be venturing with Kora into the next leg of the journey. But at least Jimmy will be joining the fun. So at least with his ties to that 40-minute village sequence, it does help bridge a gap, but it's definitely not enough to excuse it. Part 1 and 2 made 3 characters integral to their story: Gunnar, Noble, and of course, Kora. Which is why I was shocked that so little actually seems to be done with the characters of Noble and Gunnar, both feeling identical to their Part 1 versions. There wasn't a lot of growth for either. Noble's still the same cruel, evil prick he was before, just angrier. And Gunnar remains the same untrained and unskilled combatant with a heart of gold, finding ways to change the game in moments of most need. Something that does come full circle in the final battle with Noble, is Gunnar ultimately is the one to best Noble and end his threat, saving Kora in the process. I will say, allowing Gunnar to be the one to ultimately bring down Noble feels like a nice send-off, a way to let him be a hero one last time and clear the guilt from their first encounter, even if he really couldn't have done anything to change what happened. Leading into Kora though, Kora was the one to break expectations the most for me, sometimes welcome and others viewed more critically. For instance, I wasn't so bought on her and Gunnar's sudden relationship. Where they left off in Part 1, I saw Gunnar's crush as unreciprocated, so for them to suddenly be intimate minutes in felt off character. To their credit, the actors do sell it well. Their on-screen chemistry works, and I really like Gunnar's character, so I was happy for him. But what really got me was the actual assassination of Princess Isa and the royal family, and just how far events deviated from expectations. With context from the original movie, I expected that Belisarius had the royal family murdered, something Kora would have discovered, leading him to frame her to protect himself. While most of this does come to pass, Kora was actually in on the assassination plot, being the one to gun down Isa herself, only to have Belisarius stab her in the back after the act. This was the one break that was fully welcome, a unique turn on the typical story beat, and something that truly explains Kora's guilt. This isn't a "I failed to save her" story. This is a "I failed to see the light till it was too late" story. Like if Vader had allowed Luke to die and realized the error only after it was too late to bring down Palpatine and save his son. Kora was the redeemable hero that acted too late to save the true hero of the universe. Alright, time for the big one. Pacing. Pacing's still lacking this time around, unfortunately. This time, it's the polar opposite of the first. A lot of key moments fall way too fast. Kora and Gunnar's sudden relationship, the characters going from revealing Noble is dead to being told by Aris he's alive mid-thought. I get wanting to jump right into things, but with how fast it all falls, it feels they could have just skipped the beat of the Motherworld retreating without their admiral, and just have the heroes prepare to fend off the army, being surprised when Noble actually arrives on the battlefield. And the ending itself was jarring. Kora's off comment about lacking honor due to her lies not only getting Titus to reveal he knew the truth all along, but also forgive her and give her the mission to find Isa. Key moments all tossed together within 15 seconds of each other. It's just a bizarre moment, one that felt akin to a studio head saying, "Hey, Zack, great movie, really loved it and all, but one note, you didn't tease the next movie. We want a big cliffhanger to bring people back. Think you can tack something on to the very end there? Thanks, bro." Realistically, I don't see why Titus couldn't have offered Kora this quest as a means for true redemption. The way it's brought up, it feels like a reward for her finally telling the truth. And while a good message, I just don't feel the pair were built to have that sort of relationship. Instead, having Titus tell Kora that Isa's still out there, and telling her it's their job to find her, could have accomplished the same task, and feel a bit more natural. Especially considering that earlier mentioned meeting scene actually showed the exact opposite, that Titus did not trust Kora, but respected her decision to need time before she could take the necessary steps to earn that trust. While key moments do fall fast, this isn't a fast movie. It still dragged and had moments where things felt a tad padded. I mentioned it at the very beginning of the video, but I really believe parts 1 and 2 could have been edited into one slightly long film. Part 1 had 40 minutes that could have been trimmed down between the village and recruiting segments, and this movie certainly could have trimmed out some fat during the farming and war scenes that, while cool, could have saved them another 25 to 30 minutes. That's an hour of overall runtime. Plus, if the first encounter with Noble was cut down to reflect the typical midway conflict scene in most films, you've easily got a movie that ran just a little under 3 hours. Speaking personally here, I would have preferred for Noble to have ambushed the team on the way back to Velt, with Kai having saved everyone. To show Noble's danger, Bloodaxe could still die in the conflict, and Kai and Kora could have come together to kill Noble as before, but leave Kai intact. Then, instead of all the heroes' preparations being outed by a computer, Kai could have betrayed them there, perhaps now capturing Kora before she's able to board her ship, and here, Gunnar would come to kill Kai and save her as before. This could have fixed the whiplash of Kai's sudden betrayal, and helped us as an audience build real trust with him, and show why Kora herself would have trusted him so deeply, since the pair would have worked hand in hand to best Noble the first time, and prepare Velt for war. So, I knew for a long time that more Rebel Moon was to come. Zack made it clear he anticipated at least 6 of these before his story was complete, but based on how he talked, I kind of assumed the ending to part 2 was going to feel more concrete. The Scargiver does nicely wrap the Velt storyline, as well as the conflict with Noble. With both him and Gunnar dead, this felt like the perfect ending. Well, narratively speaking at least. As with both Noble and Gunnar dead, Kora's been given a clean slate. Whether she chose to stay on Velt or head to the skies with her team to fight more battles, it would be a solid full close on the story, with an easy pickup point should more be explored. It felt like the right ending point given this stage in the story, but Snyder breaks this, introducing the Princess Isa storyline right before credits roll. This isn't a huge problem, and at least for fans eagerly awaiting more, they've now got a solid idea of what the next leg of the journey will be. But stories also need natural breaks, a point where things could feel fully resolved, and this felt like a great point to do it. In the end, this is Zack's story, and he'll do what's best for him. I don't want to spend too much time here, this isn't a real complaint so much as a personal bias, but I do think this was a perfect soft close on the Rebel Moon universe, a place where it could work as a full wrap, while still keeping the door open for fans wishing to continue. And I do know where this bias comes from. When part 1 ended, I was invested. I wanted to see the next leg of the story. But I didn't get that with part 2. I wanted the soft close so I could break here without worrying about a firm unanswered storyline hanging over me. I still enjoyed my watch of part 1 and 2, but this viewing definitely proved to me that while I can find respect for Snyder and his work, he's just not for me. And I can't see the director's cut changing that. Personally, I have no issues with director's cuts, but I've always viewed them as a bonus to the viewers. But when Zack makes one, I've always felt it feels more akin to a chance to fix prior issues. And seeing as he himself seems to imply these versions were the inferior ones, it just annoys me that him and Netflix would do them at all instead of making the intended vision. But that's just my view, and I don't want my opinion to alter anyone else's. If you're excited for the director's cuts, then you should watch them, and I truly do hope they live up to or even exceed your expectations. Who knows, perhaps I'll check out the next entry to the Rebel Moon story. Unfortunately, where Part 1 built interest, Part 2 sorta killed it for me, so I can't say for certain another video will come. It may be high time that I just accept that Zack Snyder is a director I will never mesh with. As an aside, I don't know why everyone's claiming this man has no humor. Whether it's intentional or not, this scene was worth a good laugh.
Come on, you lazy people!
Not even you lazy bastards, it's you lazy people. There's just something about watching an overly nice character have to awkwardly take charge that makes me laugh.